the back.
The testimony from Fred Gonzalez. He was a witness in the Stanley Liggins murder trial. Again, Stanley Liggins is on his third trial for the murder of Jennifer Lewis, 9 years old, back in 1990. Two convictions have been overturned based on technicalities. With me here in studios, Brad Micklin. Brad, always a pleasure to have you here. So you and I were talking about this case. It's way back in 1990. A lot of the investigators have either retired, are deceased now. You can see Stanley there on your screen. But we just heard from this witness, and you and I were talking during his testimony of what was his purpose, and we finally found out the purpose was to establish that Stanley was actually at the house the day that Jennifer was killed. But at this point, okay, he's at the house. We know there was a relationship between Stanley and the mother and the father. I'm not quite there yet to say just because he was at the house, Stanley later strangled, raped, and set her on fire.
Yeah, it's hard to make that connection right now. I think part of the reason we're seeing this is the tortured history that brought this case back was a lot of reports that weren't disclosed, so now we're going to have a lot of new witnesses. But I also understand from the opening statements that the only way they're really proving this case is with circumstantial evidence that ties people that saw her last to this crime, and he happened to be one of them. I think this is what that witness is here to establish.
Yeah. You know, again, this happened way back in 1990, you know, way before a lot of technology that we have now, especially DNA that was in its infant stage way back in 1990. So there's a lot that has to come out in this trial here to secure another conviction of Stanley Liggins. We're actually going to take a quick break. We'll have more of this testimony, again, out of Iowa. Stanley Liggins on trial for the murder of 9-year-old Jennifer Lewis in 1990. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Okay, we've been listening to testimony from Mary Ann Watson. Now, she says that Jennifer Lewis on September 7th of 1990 actually came to her house to visit one of her daughters. And it's very important here. She actually said she remembered Jennifer's smile, and you could see that she identified Jennifer via a picture, and she said that is the smile she remembered. She also remembered a very key piece. You can see a car on the screen there that she saw Jennifer talking to a person in the vehicle. She couldn't identify who was in the car, but she could identify the vehicle itself. And that vehicle was determined to be that of Stanley Liggins. Again, you can see it there on your screen. It's about a 80s model Peugeot. Those cars were very popular back in the 80s and 90s. They don't make those anymore. Still here in the studio with me, Brad Micklin. Brad, this testimony is pretty key, but here's where I have a problem with it. She sees this vehicle. She identifies that Jennifer came to her house that night. She sees this vehicle, but she can't identify the driver. So if I'm a defense attorney, I would easily argue, hey, he let someone borrow his car. How do we know it was him?
I agree. I think there's going to be a lot of problems. And I think this is, again, just the early stage where they're going to be tying together a lot of pieces, because my understanding from the other 77 reports that came out over the appeal process, that there were several cars at issue and several different witnesses that identified several different cars. So I think this is just the beginning of where the prosecution is going to go with tying it all together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much to this case that we have to actually establish here. Again, Stanley Liggins has been convicted of this murder of Jennifer Lewis back in 1990. Two convictions have been overturned. This is his third trial. The prosecution, again, is trying to convict him of the murder of Jennifer Lewis back in 1990. And we just heard testimony from Mary Ann Watson, who said she last saw Jennifer the day she disappeared while she was visiting with one of her daughters. We're going to take a quick break. We'll have more live testimony from the courtroom in Iowa, Stanley Liggins murder trial. Stay tuned to the Law and Crime Network. Okay, so we were actually hearing transcript testimony from Diane Pepperton. She was a neighbor back in 1990 of Jennifer Lewis. Now, that, of course, was not Diane Pepperton on the witness stand there. Of course, many of these witnesses have deceased have died since 1990, so that's why they're doing a lot of transcript testimony. Brad, I want to toss to you really quick. So it looks like we have two separate witnesses saying they saw a car belonging to Stanley Liggins talking to Jennifer. We heard testimony from Mary Ann Young just before this witness. Then we hear the transcript of Diane Pepperton. So why was this guy, and you can see the car there in the courtroom there on your screen, why was this guy just going around following this 9-year-old girl? It's almost like he was stalking her if this testimony's true. And
that's the key question, is the testimony true? You know, while I always want to see a person who murders a 9-year-old girl punished.
Right.
But the problem I have with this kind of a case is we have a right to confront our accusers. And here we have people that are testifying by paper. The defendant can't cross-examine them. They can't question their recollection or their faded memories. It's a very dry way of proving a case, and I think it's a little unfair at this stage.
You know what? That's an excellent point. I didn't think about that. Of course, I'm just an old ex-cop. You're an attorney. You're right. You cannot cross-examine a transcript because it's previous testimony from someone that is no longer here. But I do find it interesting. Again, you know, 2 people said they saw this car. They saw a person in the car. We just heard testimony from this Diane Pepperton that Jennifer approached the driver's side. She waved. We heard testimony that Jennifer was really excited about her birthday that was coming up that weekend, which unfortunately she did not get to celebrate her 10th birthday. Again, we're covering the trial of Stanley Liggins, on trial right now in Iowa. This is his 3rd trial for the murder of Jennifer Lewis way back in 1990. We're hearing some pretty interesting testimony from some witnesses from back then that were neighbors. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss what's next in this testimony here in Iowa. Stanley Liggins on trial. Okay, again, that is transcript testimony from Diana Pemberton. She was a neighbor way back when. She testified that Jennifer came to play with her kids on the day she went missing. The key testimony there was that she saw this vehicle belonging to Stanley Liggins beckon her to come over to the car. She went to the driver's side. Of course, we heard a little bit of the cross-examination where one of her testimonies said that she wasn't beckoned to the car. But, of course, on redirect, you know, the prosecution said, what difference does it make? Did she go to the car? Still with me here, Brad Micklin. Brad, let's talk about this car here and how important it is to this case. All right, so we've heard 2 witnesses say the exact same story on the exact same day that she went to this car. I think we'll actually hear testimony, too, that the car was seen later in the evening. And this is, according to Diane, was between 5:30 and 6:30. Of course, her body was found about 9 p.m. that night. So we're still looking at a few hours timeline to say that Stanley Liggins did this crime, transported her to wherever, and then dumped her body there.
I think it's interesting as we see this testimony develop, and it's very hard to cross-examine a witness like this in the first place because you don't want to look like you're trampling on the memory of a 9-year-old girl. So It's always challenging. And we have the added fact that they're reading it from a transcript. What I did enjoy, to the extent I can say that about this cross-examination, was he at least used intonation, and it seemed a little more lively. So I think it's going to actually impact the jury a lot more than the original examination, which was a lot more dry and slow. Even the judge's review of the testimony is monotonous. So I think it added an interesting aspect to this.
Yeah, and speaking of the jury in this case, they're actually looking at someone on the stand who is not the witness. How do you think that's playing in their minds?
Difficult to say because to some extent, I think you lose sight of that. You know, you see a person who's reading from the transcript, but the question is natural. So I think in the juror's mind, they might actually lose sight that it's not the actual person and hopefully get wrapped up and pay attention to the testimony itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't envy that jury for sure. We're going to take a quick break. We have more testimony here in the murder trial of Stanley Liggins for the 1990 murder of Jennifer Lewis. She was raped, burned, and found in the field on fire. Stay tuned. You don't want to miss this here on the Law&Crime Network. Hey, welcome back to the Law&Crime Network. It looks like the courtroom in Iowa has just broken for lunch. Again, we're covering the Stanley Liggins murder trial. You can see there that courtroom is emptying out. Stanley Liggins is convicted of killing Jennifer Lewis way back in 1990. This is his 3rd trial. The previous 2 were overturned on technicalities. One, there was allegations of a paid police informant that testified against him. There was so many allegations going on in this trial. This is his 3rd trial. Just before the break, we heard transcript testimony from a neighbor who says Jennifer came to her house that day on her bike. She got approached by a vehicle. that belonged to Stanley Liggins, and she approached that vehicle. It's one of the last times she was seen before she was found later that night around 9 p.m. Near a school on fire. That's how she was found. She had been strangled, raped, and set on fire. So it was very tragic. She was 9 years old, just days away from her 10th birthday. That witness talked about how she was excited about the birthday party coming up that weekend. Unfortunately, she didn't make it. Still here with me, Brad Micklin here in the studio. Brad, really quick, we're about to hear the prosecution's opening statement here, but I want to take me back here. It's 1990. Look, back in 1990, it's my junior year of high school. I had a high top fade, you know, thought I was Kid and Play way back when. A lot has changed. A lot of these witnesses are deceased now. Their memory is not what it used to be. So how important is it to rely on these transcripts during these trials to say this is what the person testified to back then? But more importantly, how do you combat what they said? Because you really can at this point.
It's challenging. I mean, the transcripts are crucial because without that, they have nobody. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the people that were witnesses back then have either died or maybe even disappeared. I mean, it's, right, 20, 30 years. So we're forced to use the transcripts, but I think it's really going to hurt. It sort of hurts both sides. It hurts the prosecutor side because it makes it very cold, very dry. And as you know, a jury trial is often very dry and slow. We get to see the exciting parts, but they're not all like that. But then the defense has limited opportunity to really cross-examine, to go to credibility, to go to recollection, to bring in another witness that may have planned it or placed the defendant somewhere else. So I think both sides have a lot of challenges with this kind of a case.
Got it. Let's take a listen to the prosecution's opening statement in the Stanley Liggins murder trial. Take a listen. Okay, that was the prosecution's opening statement in the Stanley Liggins murder trial. We heard testimony there about the two witnesses identifying the vehicle belonging to Stanley Liggins. Then we heard testimony about Stanley giving Jennifer some money to go buy gum. I don't really understand why he couldn't go buy the gum himself. But Brad, you and I were talking while we were listening to that, and the one thing we said here is we've heard the testimony about the car. We heard testimony of people saying, yes, I saw her talking to Stanley. We know he was at the house. I haven't heard any testimony about physical evidence in this case, and how, especially in 2018, we're not talking 1990 now, we have a new jury who looks at things like DNA. How important will that be for the outcome of this trial?
I think it's going to be very important. Whenever I launch an opening statement when I'm reviewing a case like this, I really enjoy it because it gives us the map of what we're going to hear so we can follow along and know in advance. And I don't think he said anything about any direct tie to Liggins and the victim, at least to the murder that brought us this case. So I'm still waiting to hear both in this testimony and the future witnesses if they're actually going to tie him specifically to it, or if it's just going to be a bunch of people who say they saw him before it, they know his car, and then ask the jury to infer that it was actually him who committed this crime.
Yeah, exactly, because we don't want to take anything away that a 9-year-old was raped, set on fire, and left in a field by a school. We definitely don't. But the fact is, we need that physical evidence to say, yes, Stanley Liggins did that. And I think with a jury of this day and age, that's what they're going to look for. We're not talking a jury in 1990 that didn't know what DNA was. We're talking a 2018 jury that they rely on DNA in everything they do. We want to hear testimony now from Ed Zapian, who was a witness in this case. Let's take a listen to his testimony. Wow, we just heard some pretty graphic testimony there from the prosecution during this opening statement. He talked about Jennifer being set on fire, the trail of gas that led to her body, and the fact that her genital area was set on fire. Pretty disturbing. I guess that was in an attempt to hide a sexual assault. Still with me, Brad Micklin here in the studio. Brad, I want to talk about this here for just a second. I mean, what kind of monster does this to a 9-year-old little girl who was about to turn 10? We're going to have some footage, crime scene photos here on the screen here in just a second, but this was a 9-year-old girl set on fire. That is ridiculous. You can actually see there on your screen, Brad, some of the crime scene photos. For obvious reasons, we don't want to show Jennifer's body, but just talk about how sickening this is.
It's inconceivable to sit here. We try to be intellectual when we talk about these cases, and you kind of lose sight of what's really happening, what really happened and brought this case forward. And it's a 9-year-old girl that was sexually assaulted, I believe strangled and then set on fire. It's just, it's brutal. And I think if you're a juror member, it's almost impossible to not want to convict the person that's sitting trial, whether or not you think he did it.
Right, absolutely, and especially based on the fact that the other 2 trials, he was convicted of that murder, especially that testimony had a lot to do with, or the conviction had a lot to do with the testimony about his car being seen twice on that day with Jennifer. You can actually see from the original trial there on the screen, they actually brought in the actual car inside the courtroom, and they had the witnesses actually identifying the car there in the courtroom. But again, it goes back to what we were talking about here just before the last break. It's 2018. We have a new jury. They're going to want some type of DNA evidence. But I think what the prosecution was establishing was there's going to be a lack of DNA because the body was set on fire.
I agree, and I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing these kinds of pictures being brought in, because when you're sitting as a juror, you're hearing a lot of details, and especially details that happened 20, 30 years ago. I think these pictures help them put the image in their mind so that they can really connect. It makes it more real. I think without these issues or without these images, I don't think a jury would be able to really place the defendant at the scene and convict them a third time.
Yeah, absolutely. And plus, keep in mind, too, 1990, the internet was a baby, so you can't even find a lot of stuff about this case on the internet. So now we want to hear testimony from Michael Brown. He actually discovered Jennifer. What he thought he was walking up on was a simple fire at the schoolhouse. Take a listen to his testimony. Okay, sorry about that. We were going to have the testimony of Michael Brown. We'll have that after this break, so we apologize for that. But real quick, Michael Brown is the individual that found Jennifer's body, Brad, there in that field, right? So he thought he was just walking up on what he believed to be a simple fire. Then he sees this 9-year-old girl there. I can't imagine what he went through, you know, just to see that image there. I wouldn't want to be that person. Listen, I've seen some pretty graphic stuff in my days of policing, but never someone set on fire, especially a 9-year-old girl. I'm sure that does something to you psychologically that you could probably never forget.
Right, and I think, I'm not really sure yet if we have the actual witness or it's going to be his written testimony once again, but it's a brutal fact pattern, and I think this kind of testimony is going to do a couple things for the prosecution. First, it's going to really tug on the jury's heartstrings. Again, this is a 9-year-old girl who's just savagely attacked. But also, because they're going for murder, it takes premeditation in Iowa. So I think the fact that it was burned to try to, what would appear to be to conceal it, suggests the intention that he knew, or if it was him, knew what he was doing was horrible and he was trying to conceal the evidence afterwards. Right,
absolutely. So when we come back from this break, we'll have testimony from Michael Brown. He actually found Jennifer Lewis's body in the state of Iowa. Stay tuned to the Law and Crime Network. We'll be right back. Okay, that was crucial testimony there from Captain David Perrick. He was the fire chief that arrived on the scene when Jennifer Lewis's body was found on fire. Brad, he made up a good point there. He didn't want to disturb too much of the evidence, which is why he sprayed her body the way he did. But he did say that there was very little fire at the time, but he did see the body. And one of the things that we've been talking about here, especially with this new jury, is DNA and the lack thereof of DNA, right? Of course, anytime you set something on fire, it's going to destroy any DNA evidence there. So how do we get from, okay, yes, we had witnesses. We saw Stanley. It was his car. In the original trial, they brought the car in the courtroom. How do we get to, yes, Stanley Liggins did this, and he should spend the rest of his life in prison?
I don't know if we're going to get to that. I'm fortunately young enough to not know what DNA evidence was available at the time and what the scientific availability of it was, how reliable it was back in 1990.
Right.
And part of me says, well, they've convicted him twice for this. It must have been a strong evidence. But if you go back to 1990, we weren't expecting, or the jury probably wasn't expecting to have DNA evidence. It probably wasn't available and reliable.
Yep.
So now they're going to be looking for that. And I think it's going to add a challenge that the prosecution didn't have in the past.
Well, let me pose this question, right? This happened in 1990. Stanley Liggins has been in prison since 1990. If he's convicted for a third time, you and I were talking before we went on the air, at some point, wouldn't he have gotten out for time served? You know, again, she was 9 years old. It was very brutal, but it's been 30 years. So from a sentencing standpoint, wouldn't he have gotten out at this point unless it was a life sentence?
That's what I was thinking, actually. Like you said, we were talking about it. So I've been wondering about that since we've been on the air. And I have to imagine that even with a premeditative murder conviction, that he probably would have been parole eligible by this point in time. So he might actually have been released, which would explain why he's going to be sitting trial again, because it's just now to overturn the conviction. He's probably not going to save any time. And if he does, I can't imagine he doesn't get time served and possibly released.
Right. Okay. Let's hear more of the prosecution's opening statement. Let's get back in the courtroom. Okay. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. Some pretty interesting testimony, Brad, from the prosecution there that David Liggins lied about seeing Jennifer. Previous to that, he said you're going to hear from a witness that says, I saw these tail lights. They identified these tail lights to this Peugeot we've heard about. And just shortly after that, they saw a fire where Jennifer was found. Police go talk to David Liggins. Like, no, haven't seen her. But several witnesses said, yep, she was by his car twice that day. You got testimony from this person saying, we saw tail lights that match his. I didn't see her. And then he says, well, I lied because I didn't want to be a suspect in her murder. Well, wouldn't you tell the truth if you hadn't seen her, or if you had seen her, just, yeah, I saw her earlier over at this alleyway. She came to my car, and then I sent her to the store to buy gum.
Yeah, apparently that plan didn't work out well for her. She's now on trial for the third time. And it's never good to be lying to the police about something so crucial as whether or not you saw the defendant, and then to use it as a reason to say, I didn't want to be a suspect, because most of us wouldn't expect to be one. So I think it's going to be really damaging, but I do believe from the appellate division that what we're later going to hear, several other people and several other cars that may have been identified at this time, back when the reports were originally released, that may lead more to a reasonable doubt issue than we had in the past. So I'm not really sure, but it's certainly going to hurt that he lied to the police or to the police investigation. Yeah,
absolutely. You know, one of the things I always say, innocent men don't lie, right? And of course, Jennifer was set on fire, so there's this question of where was the gas? And I think there's testimony about a gas can. Let's hear more from the prosecution in their opening statement.
You're going to hear.
Okay, some pretty crucial testimony there. You just heard from the transcripts of Captain James Carpenter, who was the arson investigator way back in 1990. He talked about getting that accelerant, which they believed to be gasoline at the time. Again, Jennifer Lewis was found back in 1990 on fire at a schoolyard. She had been strangled, raped, and then left on fire. When investigators arrived, she was still on fire. Brad, let's talk about this gas here for just a second. Again, I can't imagine pulling up to that. But unless there's a witness, and I believe there is, that says, I saw a gas can inside of Stanley Liggins' car, you're still not there yet. And then playing devil's advocate, a lot of people, especially back in the 90s, carried gasoline cans in their car, whether it was for their lawnmower or in case they ran out of gas. A lot of people to this day still carry gas cans in their car for that exact reason. So we're still not there yet to say that, yes, 100% Stanley Liggins is the guy that did this.
Everything about this case is complicated by its age. I found myself wondering the same issue, that back in the 90s, was it lawful to carry gas? Because I know it's not now, but back then it might have been.
Right.
Even when you look at the evidence that they brought to the, I think it was the fire captain now, that's been preserved in some way for 30 years. Now, I know the chain of custody issues are always complicated in a criminal case, and here we have the evidence that's been maintained. They must have been changing the methods by which we maintain and retain evidence in a trial over 30 years. So I think there's going to be additional issues that come up with just the quality of the evidence that they're presenting this third time.
Got it. We're going to get back in the courtroom, hear testimony from Ed Zapian. He was at Jennifer's house on the day she went missing and was found dead. Take a listen. Okay, more testimony from Ed Zapian. He talked about being at the house that night for about a half hour where Jennifer was, and last seen with Stanley was apparently at this house as well back on September, way back in 1990. Brad, how crucial is this testimony? But the thing that strikes me here in this case, we heard Ed, we heard his previous testimony where he said they would go over there and drink and a lot of this stuff, right? So if I'm a defense witness, how credible is that testimony? You told me you're over here, you're drinking, you do a lot of this adult stuff, right? We heard allegations of drugs being sold by Jennifer's mother. So can we rely heavily on this testimony from these witnesses, especially Ed Zapien?
I think the defense is going to rely heavily because I think Zapien was one of the reports that was not released originally, and we just heard in the testimony that the clip we just played that he had a red car. So I think they're going to use it. He was at the same location, drove a similar colored car, and that maybe it was him.
Right, he had a red car. Of course, we've heard testimony about Stanley Liggins' red car in this case. So it's very interesting. But again, you know, this Ed Zapien had admitted that he was over at the house that day, but he also said he was drinking. So how credible is that testimony? We're still watching that courtroom, waiting for it to go back live. We'll have more of this trial in Iowa at the other end of this break. Stay tuned to the Law and Crime Network.